My name is Joe Lstiburek. I'm with Building Science Corporation. I've been doing this longer than I would like to admit. But one of the nice things about doing things for a long time is that you notice trends in the industry. And one of the most significant trends in construction, certainly in residential construction, is that we're beginning to move from the traditional main part of living, represented here in the image with the gray, and we're moving into basements and crawl spaces and attics and into the garages. So we're basically creating our living space totally within the edge of the building enclosure. Back in the houses that I grew up in, basements weren't basements, they were cellars. They're dank and damp places where, poltergeists would live, and we'd have vegetables and coal. And now we actually want to live in them. We're putting in bedrooms and entertainment centers and nurseries and bars and man caves and princess lofts in the basement. And people seem to think that it's real easy to finish a below-grade space, and nothing can be farther from the truth. The most difficult place to get correct is a below-grade living space. And so we're going to be focusing on how to deal with basements and the basements that people want to live in. Here are the issues that we have to deal with. We're all familiar with the fact that we have to deal with structural issues, but candidly, the structural stuff is easy compared to dealing with what really causes problems in below-grade spaces, which is water. And the two phases of water that we have to focus on are the liquid and the vapor. And now the liquid, groundwater, is the ugliest, and it's basically controlled by dealing with hydrostatic pressure. Now, what is hydrostatic pressure? It's a big word that means the weight of water. The taller the column of water, the more it weighs. If I've got a column of water against my foundation wall, the taller the column of water, the more it pushes against the foundation wall. And if I have a crack or a pathway in that foundation wall, the hydrostatic pressure will squirt that water through the assembly. And what are the odds that I'm going to have a crack in the foundation wall? Well, pretty much 100%. We build with concrete today and love concrete. Romans invented it. Greeks claim that they stole it from them, but it's been around 2,500 years. And what do we know about concrete? Well, there are only two kinds of concrete. Concrete that cracks and concrete that will crack. So what do we know about concrete? That there's likely going to be a crack. And since the time of the Romans, who knew that concrete cracked, the below-grade spaces that the Romans designed were designed in such a way where they controlled hydrostatic pressure. So what we're going to do is basically apply the lessons of the Romans 2,500 years ago and apply some modern technology and some modern advances to where the Romans started. The Romans got there first. I think we're almost as good as the Romans are now. One of the things that we learned, and the Romans taught us, is that you don't want there to be groundwater. And before groundwater becomes groundwater, it comes from the sky. So the idea is to keep rainwater from becoming groundwater. And where water hits your building, the building tends to collect all of the water that hits it and directs it to the edge of the roof assembly in this particular case. And you don't want that water to drop right beside your foundation to wet the ground. What you want to do is you want to drain it away. You want gutters and downspouts, basically drain the surface water to your neighbor's property. Give them the problem, not you. So the idea is do everything that we can to keep the surface water from becoming groundwater. When we build on top of the ground, this is pretty easy. We have our floor finish above the surrounding soil. We don't have a big hole in the ground. We drain the water away. All of this is pretty easy. One of the things that we've learned, of course, is that the ground is wet. And one of the things that we worry about is that when you have something dry touching something wet, the dry thing becomes wet. I mean, this is not complicated. You can do this experiment at home. You can take a wet thing and touch a dry thing, and the dry thing becomes wet. Well, if the building is intended to be dry and the ground is wet, where the building touches the ground, we need something to separate the building from the ground to keep the wetness in the ground from coming into the building. And one of the easiest ways to do this is to put a layer of stones between the building, in this case the concrete, and the ground, and then to line the stones with a plastic sheet that provides a vapor barrier and a capillary break so that that concrete doesn't wick or suck water into it. Pretty easy peasy to do when we're building on top of the ground. Well, sometimes we build with crawl spaces. Don't have much of an issue with crawl spaces if the crawl space grade is higher than the surrounding grade. We only get into trouble when the crawl space grade is below the surrounding grade, in which case we end up having a mini basement, and we have to use basement technology in our crawl spaces if the crawl space grade is below the surrounding grade. One of the things that we've learned over the last half century is that crawl spaces should be part of the building. They should be conditioned. They shouldn't be vented. So the idea is you want to put in a continuous ground cover. In most cases, that would be a 6 mil or 10 mil polyethylene sheet. Make it continuous and attach it to the perimeter of your foundation, and you have the conditioned space, the crawl space, heated or cooled as just part of your building. Again, easy when the grade is higher than the surrounding grade. When you're dealing with a foundation, a basement foundation, where the interior floor finish is significantly lower than the surrounding grade, we have to go back to the Romans. The idea is we want to control hydrostatic pressure. We do not want water in the ground beside our foundation to push against the foundation wall. What we want to do is we want to drain that water downward as quickly and as easily as possible. And the approach that the Romans developed was to backfill with free draining material, sand or gravel, so that the water would run downward vertically under the force of gravity faster than it could run horizontally and push against the foundation wall. But look at how magnificent this strategy is. The surface water is directed away from the edge of the foundation by sloping the grade. The top of the ground is impermeable, maybe make it difficult, a clay cap, so that it doesn't penetrate into the drainage area. But we assume that all of that technology will fail us, so some water will get in, and the secondary backup is to drain that water downward as quickly as possible to a perimeter drain. The perimeter drain is located outside of the foundation and below the foundation slab. It's surrounded by stones and a filter fabric so it doesn't get clogged up. This is the state-of-the-art in technology, 2,500 years old. Pretty amazing. Well, can we improve that? Well, sure. We can replace all of that free draining material with a drainage layer. A drainage layer a half an inch to an inch thick. In this particular case, it's a dimple mat. So all we've done is taken the Roman technology and replaced the free draining material with a thinner, more effective free draining material. The advantage of this approach, of course, is that it's significantly less expensive than digging dirt out of your ground and taking it off your site and replacing it and backfilling it with free draining material. You can put back into the hole whatever you dug out of it if you have this type of free draining material. The second thing that this helps you with is that if your foundation wall cracks, what are the odds? Well, pretty much 100%. Well, we don't care because we've able to span the cracks with in essence, our capillary break, our hydrostatic pressure control layer, the dimple mat, the drainage layer. It's important that we seal the top of this drainage mat or dimple mat or drainage layer to the foundation wall, and it's important that we integrate it with a perimeter drain on the exterior of the foundation wall. So this hasn't been done yet in this image, but where that gentleman's yellow boots are, that's where we're going to have the exterior perimeter drain, the stones surrounded by the filter fabric. Back in the day, when I was building, we would call it the drainage kielbasa. Now I think we call it the drainage burrito. I don't know, maybe it's the drainage taco if we fold it, but you get the idea. Not all of the time are we able to put the water control layer on the exterior of the foundation. In existing buildings, perhaps it's impractical or uneconomical to dig up the outside that has a water leakage problem and put in an external perimeter drain. We can do exactly the same technology on the interior of the building. We have the perimeter drain located again below the slab. We notch the concrete slab, cut through it, put in the perimeter drain, run our drainage mat on the inside. It has to run to above the surrounding grade, seal it at the top. It's a fabulous retrofit technology. How fabulous? Well, it's the technology that we use to waterproof tunnels. This is the new Eurotunnel, 60, 70 miles under the Swiss Alps, and it's completely waterproofed on the interior with the drainage mat, a dimple sheet. Exactly the same technology they would use on the outside of a foundation or on the inside of a foundation retrofit. And look at the perimeter drain. Exactly the same approach that you'd use in your house. If it works for a 60, 70 mile tunnel under your Swiss Alps, it's going to work in a foundation in North America. Here we show the assembly actually integrated with the drainage perimeter subgrade drainage system. You can see the drainage mat at the bottom of the excavation. There's more, of course. We don't just stop at dealing with controlling hydrostatic pressure at the perimeter of the foundation. We have to deal with soil gases. We want to vent the area under the slabs to the atmosphere. Well, what soil gases? Well, we have radon, pesticides, herbicides, treminicides, and one of the most significant soil gases is moisture. The ground is wet and there's air in the ground. The air is going to be at 100% relative humidity. You don't want that 100% relative humidity air to come into your foundation. So we, in essence, vent the granular pad, the stone layer under the foundation slab to the atmosphere. Atmospheric pressure changes cause the airflow to occur, coupled with heat loss from the building warming up the air in this plastic pipe. So it's a chimney, it's a ground chimney. So we're using the stack effect to vent to the atmosphere. We don't need a fan. We don't actually need electricity to make this work. What's nice about this, because it works passively, there's nothing to wear out. There's nothing that needs to be replaced. It works forever. We use the same approach with crawl spaces. We put a layer of stone on top of the ground first, then cover it with a plastic sheet. So we're creating a granular pad that provides a pressure field that we're able to couple to the atmosphere. When we're dealing with slab-on grades, it's a lot easier, of course. We just are venting the area under the slab directly to the atmosphere. Now, houses are complicated. People want to get into them easily and out of them easily, and so, amazingly enough, where we have concrete porches and stoops and decks attached to the building, a lot of bad waterproofing occurs and an awful lot of leakage occurs. And what we found is that we need to pay particular attention where a concrete porch or a concrete stoop intersects our foundation. In this particular assembly, we show a waterproof membrane running from significantly higher than the top of the concrete porch down behind it, lapped over the edge of the foundation wall. Then we provide a a bond break to prevent the concrete from adhering to the waterproof membrane, because we want to facilitate some drainage, and then we seal the top of that with a sealant. That tar paper can be replaced with a dimple mat to provide basically control of hydrostatic pressure, but we need to really do a good job of sealing it at the top. So the approach would be similar. We'd have the waterproof membrane, but the green layer would be the dimple mat. When we go to a more energy efficient building and we're actually putting continuous insulation, the continuous insulation would be installed exterior to the water control. It wouldn't be behind the water control, it would be exterior to the water control. One of the things that we've learned the hard way is that when we have porches and porch foundations that are actually extensions of the actual house foundation, we have to drop the height of the porch foundation several inches from the height of the foundation wall. Notice that where that foundation wall intersects, where the two foundation walls intersect, there's in essence a seat there. That allows us to waterproof that connection easily. If the porch foundation wall is the same height as the house foundation wall, that's almost an impossible detail to waterproof. Don't do stupid stuff. And stupid stuff would be to not drop that foundation wall several inches. As I mentioned earlier, concrete cracks, we do everything that we can to crack it in straight lines, but no matter how good we are, you have to accept the fact that there's going to be some crackage that you didn't take into account with your control joints. And that causes problems, hence the need for control of hydrostatic pressure on the exterior of the foundation wall. Life would be easy if the concrete only cracked where we wanted it to crack, but it doesn't work that way. Here's an image where it's not supposed to crack there. I had reinforcing, but there it is. It cracked anyway. So accept the fact that concrete cracks. This is a plan view of a foundation, and that image shows the control joints that we have in the basement floor slab. Notice that the column is isolated from the main body of the main concrete slab with a triangular bond break. And we try to put as many control joints in as possible, but even with a lot of control joints, there are going to be cracks that occur external to the control joints. In areas of North America where we have really deep frost penetration, the control joint is actually almost an isolation joint. This is where we have a garage foundation hitting a house foundation, and the garage foundation is not actually attached to the house foundation. We run that separation all the way up the brick above grade. And the concern is that if the garage foundation moves because of frost heave, you don't want it to take the house foundation with it. This is a real complicated detail from a waterproofing perspective if you don't control hydrostatic pressure. You control hydrostatic pressure, life is good even with these control joint details. There's our isolation joint from the column. Notice the nice diamond shape. So we're basically minimizing the stress concentration by having the control joints all intersect in a Y intersection. Flat work, concrete garages and sidewalks, lots of control joints. Remember, only two kinds of concrete in the world, concrete that cracks and concrete that will crack. Let's try to keep the cracks in the places that we select. It's real important that underneath this concrete driveway or a concrete sidewalk or pavers that we have a capillary break, basically a stone layer to isolate the concrete from the wet ground. If we're going to insulate on the inside of our foundations because we want to live inside those basements, it's important not to install a plastic vapor barrier on the inside. that plastic vapor barrier is going to trap water in the assembly. And so you're going to end up with smelly, wet, fluffy stuff between the plastic and the concrete. It causes your hair to fall out. Look what happened to this poor guy. I can't tell you how many insulated basement foundations that I've had to rip apart in the last 25, 30 years because we've broken the fundamental rule, which is we've built an assembly that's incapable of drying. Obviously, the foundation wall can't dry out into the ground because the ground is wet. The only place it can dry is into the interior, and if we prevent it from drying by putting in a plastic sheet, everything between the plastic sheet and the concrete is going to get smelly, icky, and disgusting. Icky is an engineering metric term that some of you might not be familiar with. Well, let's try to trap the moisture before it gets into the framing. And, well, good luck with that because you're going to end up with a smelly, icky space between the plastic and the concrete. It's still going to be smelly and icky. Don't do this. We call this a diaper for reasons that are obvious. Diapers are not for your foundation. So, how do we handle groundwater? Well, we intercept it on the exterior. We've talked about how to do that already with a perimeter drainage system and control the hydrostatic pressure with a dimple mat or drainage mat. But you have to assume that some of that water is going to get in anyway, no matter how good we are. So we don't want to trap it in the fluffy stuff on the interior. Even if we prevent any of the groundwater from coming in, the concrete itself has got thousands of pounds of water in it when we cast it. Concrete comes in a big truck and we pour it. It takes many years for that concrete to dry, to equilibrate. If we line it on the interior with fluffy stuff and a plastic sheet, it's going to dry into that and it's just not going to work. We also have to deal with soil gas from underneath the foundation and air leakage from the interior in the wintertime, carrying moisture behind the plastic sheet and the fluffy stuff and accumulating in the wall. We need another strategy here. And last, concrete wicks water into it because it's a porous material through a mechanism called capillarity. We need some kind of a capillary break between the footing and the ground, or between the footing and the rest of the foundation. Capillarity was explained by a long dead guy that got knighted by Queen Victoria, Lord Kelvin, basically the Kelvin equation. If you plot the Kelvin equation versus pore size, you find that the tinier the pores, the greater the capillary wicking. An example of capillary wicking would be to take a paper towel, roll it up into a tube, and put one end of it a glass of water. The water wicks up the paper towel because of the pore size in the paper. The tinier the pores, the greater the capillary wicking. Well, if I was to replace the paper towel with a column of concrete and the glass with a bucket of water, I could get capillary rise in concrete to a height of 10 kilometers or 6 miles. Concrete sucks big time. If I'm to replace the column of concrete with a column of wood, I can have capillary wicking in wood to the height of the tallest tree, about 400 feet. A lot of people don't even think about how those leaves get water. We don't have these giant pumps run by electricity at the bottom of the roots pumping water up 300, 400 feet. We have capillarity, and the Kelvin equation explains it. This is a real problem for us when we have a porous material touching something wet like the ground. It gets even more complicated. Glass is not porous, so it's not subject to capillarity in the material. But if I have two panes of glass and I place them closely enough together, the spacing itself becomes a capillary pore. And that's what happens with wood siding. Where wood siding is overlapped, the overlap gap is tight enough to create a capillary pore and we get wicking. That's why we now paint the back side of the siding. It's called back priming to prevent the capillary wicking at the overlap. Now, 150 years ago, believe it or not, um, old tradesmen recognized this, and we had oval nails. We had oval-headed nails, and when we blind nailed, the oval-headed nail created a bump to create a capillary break between the overlaps. We don't see oval-headed nails anymore, but we use the technology to fix things. We would use wedges to separate the laps to create basically a capillary break, because it's impractical after the cladding is up to pull it off and coat the back side, but we could create a gap. So what are the lessons here? Well, we can take materials with tiny pores and fill them in, or take materials with tiny pores and make them big. In other words, big pores are not a problem, no pores are not a problem. It's tiny pores that are a problem, so we take tiny pores and get rid of them, or take tiny pores and make them big. In a foundation, we make the tiny pores in a concrete basement slab big by putting it on 6 inches of large stones, so we have a large pore. On the outside of the foundation wall, we paint it with black, sticky, smelly stuff, where we put a dimple mat to create a capillary break. The difficulty is what do we do at the footing? And we didn't care about this when we weren't finishing our basements. We just let the stuff wick up and evaporate the inside, and we would call it the ring of dampness if you've ever been in these basements that have been unfinished. Well, if you now finish the inside with wood studs and fluffy stuff and cover that with plastic, you're doomed. Doom is a engineering term that denotes not a good outcome. So we need some kind of a capillary break. This is a capillary break being installed on the top of a footing. It's a fully adhered membrane. This particular product has a fleece back that allows it to adhere to the damp concrete. Let's say that we're actually going to insulate the inside of this foundation wall with a non-water sensitive insulation. Rigid insulation does that extremely effectively, but rigid insulation is not an air barrier, and we've had issues where soil gas migrates between the slab and the concrete foundation following the joints and the gaps in the rigid insulation. Those 2 red dots on this image are a big deal. They represent continuous air seals that are necessary to provide air barrier continuity between the concrete slab, which is the air barrier, and the concrete foundation wall, which is the air barrier. So the lower red dot is a bead of sealant that seals the slab to the rigid insulation. The upper red dot is a continuous bead of sealant that seals the top back edge of the rigid insulation to the concrete foundation wall. If that's not done, this is a case where we had some pretty serious odor issues where the soil gas was running up between the rigid insulation. In this particular case, it's the pink stuff, and you see the wetness and the biological growth leading to the odor issues between on the surface of the concrete. This is another example of that. We need an air seal between the back surface of the rigid insulation, and we need a second air seal between the top edge of the concrete slab where it intersects the rigid insulation. Here we have an image of a membrane on the top of the footing. We have the rigid insulation layer at the perimeter. When we cast the concrete slab, we still have to apply those 2 continuous beads of sealant, one at the top edge of the concrete slab where it intersects the pink stuff in this particular case, and we need a continuous bead at the top back edge of the pink rigid insulation where it intersects the concrete wall to address that soil gas pathway. We then can stud the interior of the assembly with wood studs, and it's perfectly acceptable now to put fluffy stuff in between the wood studs. Just don't cover the fluffy stuff with a plastic vapor barrier. With the continuous rigid insulation to the interior of that concrete foundation wall, we do not need an interior vapor barrier. Any interior moisture that wants to pass through the framing and the fluffy stuff no longer is able to access a cold surface because the surface of the interior rigid insulation is warm. We don't experience condensation. But what's also nice is it means that everything is able to dry to the interior now because we don't have that plastic vapor barrier. This is a really good way of doing things. Now, where we have a step in the foundation wall, we need to run the rigid insulation over the top to also protect the top surface of the concrete. That concrete is going to be cold. It's going to be the temperature of the ground. And this is a problem not in the winter, but a problem in the summertime, where that surface could actually cause sweating and condensation in the summertime when interior moisture-laden air in your basement hits that cold surface. Notice that we have blue insulation, we have pink insulation. The color of the insulation doesn't matter, we just don't want it to be fluffy. Where we have a garage attached to a house and we've got new construction, we may as well accept the fact that we're going to end up wanting to live in that garage and condition it. So it makes sense to insulate underneath that garage floor before the slab is cast, and we need to put the rigid insulation to the interior of that so that we prevent the thermal bridge between the concrete slab and the foundation. We can protect the exposed rigid insulation with a layer of fiber cement or a cellular PVC layer, PVC sheet. On the other side of the wall, where the garage foundation is just basically being held up by a stem wall on footing, notice how we've insulated the interior of the stem wall to the top of the foundation footing. That's to control frost heave and thermal bridging. What if I don't like rigid insulation? Can I use spray foam? And the answer is absolutely you can. But the spray foam that you want to use is 2-pound density polyurethane foam. You don't want to use the 1/2-pound density as it's too vapor open. This obviously addresses the issue with respect to the gas leakage or the soil gas leakage between the slab and the foundation wall. Now, if you use the spray foam, you still have to deal with the hydrostatic pressure on the outside. You can do it the old-fashioned Roman way, or you can use a dimple mat or drainage mat, but no matter what you do below grade, you need to control the hydrostatic pressure, and the best location to do this is on the outside. Don't use steel studs in your foundation. They're thermal bridges. Steel is 300 times more conductive than wood. The reason I know this is I've never seen wood wiring. Do not stud the inside of your foundation. Those steel studs will get so darn cold they're going to condense water. You'll end up with mold up the wazoo. Wazoo is a metric term. It's 2 yin-yangs, so you be careful. If you insist on using steel studs, run the rigid insulation continuously behind them and have the steel framing to the inside. And don't put fluffy stuff in between. So just continuous insulation behind a thin steel stud, or in this case a hat channel, and nothing in between. No vapor barrier to the inside of this, and you'll be as happy as this guy is. What do we got here? Well, we got a crack. I know you're all shocked that concrete actually cracks. Well, we need to control the hydrostatic pressure. We need a free draining layer or a dimple mat to provide control at this kind of a crack.